Well, here we are at the end of another first season of a Star Trek series. This time for Star Trek Lower Decks. Remember when these were rare? Now it seems like you can't even blink without another Star Trek series premiering. Oh look, there goes another one. Oh. But Lower Decks is in many ways the strangest Star Trek show ever conceived, doing several things all at once that don't instantly register as a perfect fit for Trek. It's the first Star Trek animated show in about 50 years, and while I do love a lot of what the animated series was able to do with its budget, and I think it's a highly underrated gem despite its reused animation and, let's say, endearingly campy elements?
And when I put this one on, I discovered this. When you all finish laughing, I'd appreciate an explanation.
Lower Decks is the first animated show to actually be given real validity and credence by the larger Star Trek community. It's also Star Trek's first ever out-and-out comedy series, with an explicit intention to make you laugh, rather than Trek's long tradition of, doing that accidentally. Oh boy, did it make us laugh throughout the years. Usually at it, not with it.
Oh, God, would I love to show you.
Doctor, there must be a cure, some formula.
Also, Star Trek did have some comedy episodes, like that time Crusher had sex with a candle.
Oh, Ronan. I had no idea I could feel this one.
Wait, that was meant to be a serious episode? Lower Decks was also going to be the first Star Trek show to not focus explicitly on a bridge crew. And yes, Discovery did focus on lower-ranking bridge officers, and Star Trek Picard technically wasn't even on a Starfleet ship, but those shows were still dealing with the upper echelons and decision-makers of their respective shows. Lower Decks, by contrast, which was inspired by the Star Trek The Next Generation episode of the same name that similarly focused on lower-ranking crew members, was going to look more at the one-pipped collar elements of the Trek universe. But even beyond all of that stuff, and perhaps most notably, Lower Decks was also going to be a spiritual successor to perhaps the most beloved and successful Star Trek series ever, The Next Generation. While Star Trek Picard was a direct continuation of elements of that part of the franchise, Lower Decks is perhaps the closest that post-2009 Star Trek has ever come to recapturing that same energy of the original voyages of the USS Enterprise D. And this perhaps was the most intriguing point about Lower Decks. It's probably not a surprise to any in the Star Trek community that modern Star Trek, and especially Discovery and Picard, have been hotly debated, with some embracing these modern incarnations' desire to boldly try new directions with how we tell Star Trek stories, that includes myself, and others having felt that they've flown too far afield of what Star Trek should be. And that's not getting to each show's specific stories and merits, as well as some of the more, unfortunately, toxic discussions surrounding those shows. Yet even those who like Discovery and Picard, which again include myself, also felt a twinge of nostalgia for the Star Trek series of yore. So with Lower Decks trying to explicitly evoke Trek's beloved past, while at the same time poking fun at it, on top of all those other new elements it was bringing to the table, it left many wondering if Lower Decks' reach would exceed its giant green space-handed grasp. So how did Star Trek Lower Decks' first season actually fare? Let's look at the positives and negatives of the first season of Star Trek Lower Decks.
Well, I study real hard at the Starfleet Academy, 'cause I want to be on your crew. And when I finally stepped out of the console on a bridge, I swore myself a look at you. But Captain Picard, you're so handsome and just, and everyone wants to serve under you. And when you say these words to me, I melt like butter. Love everything you say. Engage, engage.
Star Trek Lower Decks was created by showrunner Mike McMahon, who served as writer and producer on the incredibly popular Rick and Morty animated series, as well as the creator of the Rick and Morty-esque series Solar Opposites, which also premiered in 2020. Mike McMahon is having a better 2020 than most of us by a long shot, that's for sure. But perhaps most notably for Star Trek fans, Mike McMahon was also known for his Star Trek The Next Generation Season 8 Twitter thread, where he humorously pitched his concepts for a potential continuation for TNG, albeit with a very comedic tone. That Twitter thread helped him get the job on Lower Decks, and it could only have been created by someone who truly loved Star Trek The Next Generation inside and out, someone who knew it well enough to dissect the tropes, inconsistencies, and odd cheesiness of that era of the franchise, yet still loved it all the same for its wonderful characters, thought-provoking worlds, and attempt to showcase an intelligent science fiction world built around the idea that humanity had prospered into the future. And when watching Star Trek Lower Decks, that love is easily the first thing that shines through. The look and feel of Lower Decks, despite it taking place slightly after Star Trek Nemesis in the Star Trek timeline, just so perfectly evokes the feeling of the Next Generation. The main ship of the series, the USS Cerritos, even looks like one of those Federation ships built by bashing together the model of other Star Trek ships, a common practice on the Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. On top of that, the ship's interiors, uniforms, sound effects, and the look of the alien ships and designs all place you instantaneously right into the world of the Next Generation perfectly, and yet also still manage to just feel a hair different enough to make Lower Decks feel distinct. For example, the uniforms on this series very much evoke the Next Generation while still having their own twinges and touches as well. The animation is similarly beautiful. Gone are the reused animations and lower budget effects of Star Trek the Animated Series. Lower Decks instead looks gorgeous. While the artwork is deceptively simple, it consistently remained malleable and creative enough to show off some truly out-of-this-world artwork, allowing things that could never have been done even with the biggest of budgets on a live-action series, and things that we all wanted to see on a Star Trek show. I mean, take a look at this planet explosion, or this gorgeous bug ship, or whatever this is. But more importantly, the actual story and characters of Lower Decks felt distinctly the Next Generation as well. While typically on a Star Trek show we usually focus on the bridge crew, this show focuses on 4 lowly ensigns, Mariner, Boimler, Tendi, and Rutherford, who each bring something fun to the table, and in the case of Mariner and Boimler, quickly became some of the most well-characterized Star Trek characters to be found in the first season of a Trek show. While other Trek series often took a long time for characters to really settle into the versions that we eventually came to love them as, the Lower Decks writers seem to have a perfect idea of who Mariner and Boimler were right off the bat. Mariner instantly comes across as an arrogant and brash Starfleet type, one who always feels like they know what's best in any situation. Yet in Mariner's case, her confidence is well earned, as we consistently see her always able to outthink, outpunch, or outmaneuver any situation she finds herself in. In fact, this hyper-competence is often what leads her to be at odds with Starfleet in general, which she sees, rightly, as a bureaucratic nightmare that often gets in the way of actually doing good at the right time. Something that shows like Deep Space Nine would sometimes deal with, and even Next Generation itself.
I'm so sorry I made sure that some humble farmers who can't afford to wait for Starfleet bureaucracy to notice them got some help so they didn't have to starve.
However, before all of you leave this video and go yell Mary Sue inside your favorite Facebook group, while Mariner's characterization could easily have made the character come off as annoying and full of herself, it also leads to what makes her endearing and gives her an intriguing flaw. Because she actually wants to be in Starfleet. We see many times that she believes in Starfleet's mission of helping others and that she actually enjoys the adventurous do-gooder nature that inspires every Starfleet officer and us Star Trek fans. But sometimes her own overconfidence and distrust of the system gets in her own way. We see many times throughout the season that Mariner could easily be one of the best captains and officers in Starfleet if she really wanted to, but has such disdain for that career path as well as indecisiveness in her own desires and sense of self that it prevents her from actually doing the most good. It's also nice to see a Star Trek show feature a character that isn't instantaneously desirous of advancing in rank, but still trying to figure out what she wants. It so perfectly fits in the Star Trek ethos of a humanity of the future pursuing its own desires rather than prescribed career paths. Yet it also gives Mariner an interesting arc going into the future. What will she decide what she wants to be? And can she get out of her own way in order to get there?
You only break rules because you know that's what everyone expects you to do. If you really were a badass, you'd do the hard thing and just be a good officer. They're not casting you as the villain, you are.
I also would be incredibly remiss without saying how much Mariner has been celebrated by many black women within the Star Trek fan community for being an excellent representation of a nuanced and flawed black woman at the center of a Star Trek show. Between Discovery's Michael Burnham, Raffi Mussaker on Picard, and Mariner, not to mention Captain Freeman as well on Lower Decks, it's honestly insanely refreshing that Star Trek has really doubled down on showing multifaceted, heroic, and yet still interestingly flawed and diverse black women. Maybe I'm wrong, but I honestly don't think any other franchise has done as great a job showcasing this specifically underrepresented community. Not to mention the many other communities that modern Trek has worked to represent, pushing forward Star Trek's continued and ever-improving legacy of not just showcasing diversity, but inclusion as well. Modern Star Trek, as well as all of Star Trek throughout its over 50-year history, has certainly not been without mistakes in its representation of minority communities, from objectifying women to leaning into the bury your gays trope, for example. But I am honestly heartened that today's Trek writers seem to constantly be trying to take that criticism to heart and still work to push forward Trek's infinite diversity and infinite combinations philosophy. But with all that being said, I also should say I am by no means the only voice you should listen to on that front. So I'd recommend the Women at Warp and the Black Tribbles podcast, as well as a recent episode of the official Star Trek podcast that I have linked down below for even more discussion of the failures and successes of the Star Trek franchise's representation of blackness and women. Speaking of career ambitions though, let's move on from Mariner and focus on Boimler. Boimler is another surprisingly endearing character who worked way better than I initially thought he would. Boimler is initially introduced as the stereotypical sitcom type character who only cares about getting ahead and won't let anyone or anything distract him from his route to the captain's chair. Yet who actually doesn't really completely earn his know-it-all attitude. And again, this isn't exactly original for a character type for a comedy, and like Mariner, could easily have become tropey and grating in and of itself as a character type. But as the season goes on, Boimler begins to show that he too, like Mariner, has layers of depth that root this archetypical character in its own Trek flavor. While certainly Boimler is ambitious and still too naive to earn his overconfidence, we also see that his heart is often in the right place. In the episode Much Ado About Boimler, he is quick to turn on his mutinous fellow freaks, quote-unquote on freaks there, but does so out of a desire to come to a safe and mutually beneficial solution rather than him wanting to gain brownie points with his commander.
The only reason I told you is so nobody gets hurt. We're all Starfleet. We have to follow the rules.
I am the rules!
Wait, we can talk this out. Sir, don't tell them my title. Don't tell them my title.
He definitely does care about those around him, and also will definitely set aside his ambition when the greater good demands it, as we see in numerous episodes. It's also why he and Mariner bounce so perfectly off each other as the show's leads. They both share that core Star Trek ethos of wanting to make the universe a better place, but Mariner is more the spirit of the law and Boimler is more the letter of the law, allowing them to balance each other out well and teaching each other things as the story goes forward. Yet, while Boimler is more often criticized than Mariner is by the show itself for focusing on the minutiae over the bigger picture, the show has also shown its willingness to display when Mariner goes too far as well, such as in the episode Cupid's Errant Arrow, where Mariner nearly causes herself to go insane when she can't believe that Boimler could possibly have a well-adjusted, caring girlfriend. I also love that Mariner's flaws get built up out of understandable, if over the top, actual trauma and backstory instead of just being a weird quirk of the character. That storyline in Cupid's Errant Arrow where Mariner goes crazy could have easily just been a crazy thing that Mariner does because Mariner, but we actually get character reasons for why that is, something that a lot of sitcoms sometimes forget to do. These dynamic characterizations create a wonderfully balanced character pairing that allows Boimler and Mariner to fit well as a team, as well as have their own stories on their own terms and with their own arcs that don't require the other character in order to advance. Like Rick and Morty did for me before it, I'm honestly really surprised that an animated series that could easily have felt over the top and ridiculous given its setting, world, and heightened tone, would have such down-to-earth and relatable characters like Mariner and Boimler. I actually many times feel and understand what they're going through as characters, especially in the case of Mariner. We definitely get the sense and hints that Mariner has had some hardships in her past that made her this way, and I'm honestly curious to see how the show handles the weight and depth of her character as she continues going forward into further seasons of the show. It was also not something I was really expected when this show started out. But all that is slightly less true when it comes to the other main characters on the show, Rutherford and Tendi. Both of those characters do have their own unique quirks and interests. I particularly love how Tendi is incredibly overexcited and energized to be in Starfleet, basically being a Trekkie within the Star Trek universe itself. She's also incredibly naive, letting herself get wrapped into situations where she's in over her head, but still manages to find her way out of them through her positive nature. I also love that the show highlights her alienness as an Orion in small and subtle ways.
Come on, dude, Orions are pirates! Pillaging's your whole thing!
Okay, stop! It is not my whole thing. And for your information, many Orions haven't been pirates for over 5 years!
But I am saddened that most of the time she's just written as basically a green-skinned human. Similarly, Rutherford is also a giant geek, though more focused on the technical side of things than Tendi is. And like Tendi's Orionness, Rutherford's implant also gives him some unique abilities, stories, and humor. But like Tendi, he's mainly played as an overly geeky human, rather than anything specifically alien or different, which gave us really wonderful characters like Spock, Data, Odo, or many others throughout Star Trek. We don't really have that, outside of humanity kind of character that most Star Trek shows have. Tendi and Rutherford, while certainly good bases for characters, don't really stand out as much as unique people in and of themselves as much as Boimler and Mariner do, outside of Tendi and Rutherford honestly being incredibly earnest, hyper-competent nerds. And don't get me wrong, I enjoy them and I enjoy how they're used, and I also like the cute running storyline of Rutherford having feelings for Tendi but not being able to express them, but both characters could stand to have some more development and backstory going into season 2. Speaking of characters though, Lower Decks also introduced us to a brand new bridge crew. Lower Decks smartly gave us creative ways to get to know the personalities of our bridge crew in the show's first few episodes, without having them overshadow our main Lower Decks characters, such as the episode where Rutherford gets the chance to work in multiple departments, or Mariner going on an away mission with Commander Ransom in another episode. I also love the frustrated and distrustful mother-daughter relationship between Mariner and her mother, Captain Freeman, that allows us to have an emotional arc between the bridge crew and our characters beyond simply letting them be shipmates. And even more so, the bridge crew smartly never takes much of a center stage after the show's initial batch of episodes, allowing them to be background elements for our main characters' emotional arcs, even if the missions the bridge crew are dealing with are actually the main impetuses for the episode's plots. Honestly, my only incredibly, and I mean incredibly minor criticism here is that after we flesh out the bridge crew as real characters in the first few episodes, perhaps even more so than Tendi and Rutherford in Ransom and Freeman's cases, the bridge crew quickly becomes more stereotypical in their characterization going forward, feeling more like trope stock versions of bridge crew characters than real people, having cliched lines and storylines.
We have to find a way to end this peacefully! We're Starfleet, damn it!
Now, to be fair, that is certainly part of the point and humor of Lower Decks, that they are kind of tropey bridge crew characters, but it also was mildly tonally weird after we had already gotten to know them so well as individuals in the first few episodes of the show. Though I will say Dr. T'Ana is an incredible treat, and I will watch the hell out of a show with Dr. T'Ana. I'm just saying, give us that spin-off magic there, CBS.
Guess I'll have to shave my
Yeah, maybe you should.
She's talking about her pussy. Get it? 'Cause she's a cat. And one last thing I will say about the character dynamics is that I also wish the show had been a tad more willing to break up the character pairings a bit more. Too often we got Boimler and Mariner paired together and then Rutherford and Tendi off doing their own thing as well. And this makes perfect sense most of the time because those character pairs have the most potential to advance their individual characters' arcs. But I also would like to better know how Boimler feels about Tendi or Rutherford, for example, beyond them simply being coworkers he likes to hang out with. Do they share secrets or experiences or in-jokes that even Boimler doesn't have with Mariner, for example? I don't really know because they never interact much outside of group settings or their own individual pairs. Even the one time that Tendi was paired off with Boimler in the episode Much Ado About Boimler, Tendi mostly spent the episode with her dog rather than actually hanging out with Boimler. Though I totally understand that because that dog is the best girl in the world. Yes, she is. Who doesn't want a cube-shifting, flying, talking dog? I do. I know I do. But I hope that this is something that can be better explored in season 2 of Lower Decks. The relationship pairings, not the dog. Though I hope the dog comes back too. Now on to the storylines. As I said before, Lower Decks is clearly evoking the next generation, and that continues into the types of stories that Lower Decks wants to tell. Every episode of Lower Deck feels like a riff on a previous Star Trek episode, but taking the concept of that episode to the nth degree. From the holodeck becoming homicidal, to the alien ship we're studying suddenly becoming deadly, to dealing with alien politics in the face of a disaster, to the weirdly dangerous romance of the week, almost every story has been done before on another series of Star Trek. But Lower Decks always manages to find humor or a unique twist on that scenario. The homicidal Microsoft Clippy-inspired Badgie who evokes TNG's Moriarty was a particular humorous highlight for me, but I also loved the fastly evolving ship in the episode Moist Vessel, which was a really cool sci-fi and visual idea that never could have been done on a live-action show that was more focused on the concept rather than the humor. And I appreciate that Lower Decks does have those cool sci-fi crazy ideas that are just cool crazy sci-fi ideas, not just humorous ones. Additionally, almost all of these stories do what Trek stories do best: focus on character. Nearly every plot thread in the show served to further a character's plot arc, whether it was highlighting that Tendi and Rutherford like being on the Cerritos rather than wanting to move to a better position on a better ship, or Mariner wanting to hide the fact that she's competent in order to avoid a promotion from her friend. However, this wasn't always universally the case. Episodes like the courtroom-esque focused Veritas served more to deconstruct and make fun of the tropes of Star Trek rather than really advance any character drama. And that's fine. Sometimes it's okay to just want to have some fun on a Trek show. There are certainly many episodes of Star Trek that I really, really love that are just having fun and don't really have much more to say about the characters. But I'm glad that the show does tend to focus more on character-centric stories rather than fun deconstruction of Trek trope stories. I also love that Lower Deck constantly tries to play with its own story structure. No two episodes in season 1 felt like they were completely structured the same way. While some episodes featured the typical A, B, and C plot structure of most Star Trek shows, with 3 stories being told simultaneously, they were often subversions of the normal Trek episode formula, with the C-level plot, the one giving the least attention, often being the one with the biggest ramifications, like the destruction of a planet or the ship. The A and B plots of Lower Decks are often more focused on smaller scale emotional arcs for our main characters. Yet still other episodes of Lower Decks stayed on one plot throughout the entire show's runtime, or shared equal weight between 2 different stories. Or, in the case of Veritas, gave us little interconnected vignettes focusing on each character that were closed off in and of themselves. The show's willingness to play with its own plot structure is perhaps its most inventive, yet subtle take on the Trek formula. That all being said though, Lower Decks does spend a lot of its time comedically deconstructing the tropes of the Trek universe, which is an incredibly tight line to walk. When it comes to deconstruction of universes and ideas, it's often best done when it's outside of the franchise it's deconstructing rather than within it, as deconstruction sometimes can lead easily to ruining the believability of a universe, as well as ignoring or even subverting the core themes of what the franchise was all about. Take a look at something like Batman v Superman, for example, which tried to be a gritty deconstruction of superhero films, but ended up foregoing what made someone like Superman so inspiring in the first place. It didn't construct before it decided to deconstruct. Deconstruction is even more difficult when you add comedy to the mix, because comedy itself is often based on doing the unexpected or ridiculously out of place thing. Take The Orville, for example, which is itself an explicit deconstruction and parody of Star Trek, at least during its first season. That show, while certainly enjoyable, and I do like The Orville, I'm not saying I hate it or anything like that, but it isn't really believable in its own universe because it's a parody, especially in the show's first season. Season 2 got a little bit more serious and better about being more cohesive. But I mean, do you really believe a captain in Star Trek would actually act like Seth MacFarlane's character does throughout that show's first season and still have a job on a Federation starship? Like I said, The Orville does much to try and change this. It's more grounded yet still funny second season, but that shift itself shows how difficult that line is to walk. That's also why something like Galaxy Quest is so well done, because its metatextual discussion of Star Trek explicitly points out how ridiculous and cheesy the Star Trek universe is, and because it points out that it's just a TV show within the canon of Galaxy Quest, it can get away with breaking the believability of its own show. So given all of that, Lower Decks could easily have broken the Star Trek universe, and it often comes really close to doing so. The episode Much Ado About Boimler, for example, left me feeling incredibly uncomfortable on my first watch. In that episode, we learned that Starfleet crew members who experience accidents like the ones we've seen numerous times throughout every single series of the Star Trek franchise are sent away to something that's called the Farm, a place that initially appears to be a horrific nightmare ship where everyone is ignored and mistreated. And while this is done for comedic effect, this idea would have completely broken the world of Star Trek, which highlights that Starfleet and the Federation desires to care for and respects the sanctity of all life, regardless of ability. Yet, Lower Decks expertly uses this to its own advantage, often pulling the rug out from your expectations that it would break the rules. Like, for example, in Much Ado About Boimler, we actually learn that the farm is totally just a really nice resort for people to relax on while they get medical help. And we see something similar in the episode Envoys, where we expect Rutherford's crewmates to be upset when he's asked to be transferred to new departments, but instead they shower him with praise and understanding like any good Starfleet officer would for someone trying to discover what they love in a universe where career paths don't necessarily have to be a straight line.
Consider your request granted! Oh man, this is exciting. I'm sure wherever you end up, they'll be lucky to have you.
So basically, Lower Deck manages to both deconstruct and uphold the Star Trek universe by subverting your expectation that it would subvert your expectations. I know, that's kind of a real head trip up there, but kind of trust me on that one, I guess. Sufficeth to say, Lower Decks is a loving send-up of the Trek universe that still somehow manages to make me, mostly, believe that it takes place in the same universe of Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, Discovery, and the original series, and The Next Generation, and, all the rest of them. However, while I do find the deconstruction of the Trek universe to be incredibly hilarious in this show, it also does leave me with one tad disappointment with Lower Decks, that I feel it's forgetting about the Trek formula. Star Trek, and especially Star Trek The Next Generation, was always ready to tell incredibly meaningful stories about our world today, using sci-fi metaphor to discuss prescient political and social issues. And Lower Decks honestly feels like it would be a perfect fit for such types of discussions, being able to focus on meaningful stories about authority, displacement of power, what it means to be in the working class, and the failures of too much bureaucracy and lack of ground-level empathy due to self-importance. These are all things that we do need to discuss and hear about today's society. And while we do get elements of those types of stories at times, with Mariner's desire to give farming equipment to farmers in defiance of Starfleet regulations in the show's pilot, or the episode where Captain Freeman and the bridge crew instigate a directive that view the lower decks crew more as cogs in a machine than people in a really interesting discussion of working environments, those types of stories were few and farther between than I'd hoped. Don't get me wrong, I love Star Trek's character-focused drama and cool sci-fi concepts just like anyone else, but I also feel like Lower Decks has the chance to tell really didactic, political, and social stories that previous Trek shows never really could because they were focused on the upper-level crew. I would love to see Lower Decks deal with more working-class issues, things that we didn't really ever get to see on Star Trek outside of with characters like O'Brien. You know, when O'Brien wasn't being regularly tortured by the writers. You sweet summer child, O'Brien. I'm sorry the universe didn't appreciate you, but at least it will recognize your brilliance in the end.
Perhaps the most important person in Starfleet history, Chief Miles O'Brien.
Most important man in Starfleet? And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that what Lower Decks has delivered has been bad or it's gotten things wrong or anything like that, just that I think it is one element that I especially look for in my Star Trek shows, that parable-type tale, that I think Lower Decks can still work to live up to. There's also one final thing that I want to talk about. While Lower Decks' clear love of referencing every corner of the Star Trek universe is one of its greatest assets, it's also paradoxically its greatest flaw. Much of Lower Decks' humor and stories come from referencing previous episodes of Star Trek canon. I don't think there's a single minute of any Lower Decks episode that doesn't feature at least 10 different background or verbal Easter egg references for someone that's a Trekkie like myself that can find that references other parts of the Star Trek universe. Yet, while this is certainly awesome for us Trekkies, I often do wonder if it can be off-putting to a non-Trek fan. Let me highlight another example just to make you understand what I'm trying to say. The Marvel MCU movies are known for a ton of Easter eggs, but none of them require you to know the reference to understand the plot going forward. It never takes away from your enjoyment if you miss them, but it heightens your enjoyment if you do catch them. But in Lower Decks, there are many times that you know a reference is happening within the plot itself. Like with Rutherford doing the fan dance, or Q showing up to test the crew, or the Romulans mentioning the Remans.
Remans.
Oh, they're the worst.
It's definitely really funny for a Trekkie, but I also know from watching the show with friends of mine who aren't big Trekkies that it can also be frustrating if you're watching the show and constantly being actively reminded that there is stuff you're missing if you're not a Trek fan. Every single time I watched an episode with a non-Trek fan, there were numerous awkward moments where I was laughing my butt off and my friends just politely stared at the TV, and I would have to explain the joke later, which always ruins it. Now, the show never feels like it's completely impenetrable if you're not a Trek fan. The characters and stories are strong enough on their own, and there are some non-hyper-specific Trek-related jokes, or just some general sci-fi trope jokes. But that all being said, while I, a longtime Trek fan, may find Boimler making 5 references to ridiculous moments in Star Trek history all in a row to be absolutely hilarious,
Did Picard know about the Borg? Did Kirk know about that giant Spock on Phylos? Did Dr. Crusher know about that ghost in the lamp thing from the Scottish planet that she hooked up with that one time? That whole thing.
those are all jokes that my non-Trekkie friends won't laugh at. And that means that there's a section of each episode that they don't find funny. And this is honestly a larger existential issue that faces the Trek franchise as a whole. As a 50-year-old franchise, it becomes harder and harder to welcome new people into the fold. While Star Trek Discovery certainly can be welcoming to newer fans, its first 2 seasons still had a fair reliance on previous Trek lore, like with the Klingons or the Mirror Universe or Captain Pike and Spock themselves. And with the last major influx of Star Trek fans coming from the Kelvin Star Trek films, and Lower Decks and even Star Trek Picard not being the most welcome of starting places for newer fans, it does leave me mildly worried for the longevity of the franchise as a whole if it continually focuses on catering to its existing fans instead of trying to find new ones. And I'm not saying that's a problem with Lower Decks specifically. If its goal was to cater to its current fanbase, I think it did so incredibly well. It felt like it was joking alongside Star Trek fans instead of pandering to us. But it also does make me wonder about that sword of Damocles that may be hovering over the whole franchise. One thing I will say to counteract this, though, is that as the season went on, and especially in the finale, I saw more jokes that started to come out of Lower Decks' own sense of self and continuity, rather than it relying on previous iterations of Trek. The fact that Badgie comes back in the finale, or that Shax dies while fighting in the middle of an explosion in the truest expression of his best self, are excellent examples of how Lower Decks started to shift to more self-referential humor than metatextual and intertextual humor. Speaking of that, though, I really love that this show started to have more continuity within itself towards the end of the season. The characters actually grew and evolved, and things that happened in previous episodes seemed to have weight. It seemed to strike a great balance between episodic storytelling and setting continuity that was truly amazing. Things like Tahana and Shaq's romance in the background, or Boimler staying true to himself and taking a post on the Titan, are excellent examples of this. And while we're on the Titan, I will also say that it was wonderful to see Lower Decks actually be a continuation of the Next Generation era timeline, finally paying off the wishes and desires of so many Trekkies who have longed for a post-Nemesis Star Trek series. While Star Trek Picard did explore that post-Nemesis, post-2009 Hobus Supernova storyline, it did seem to skip over a lot of the things that fans wanted to see, just due to the fact that Patrick Stewart has aged so much, and so we needed to show decades of time elapsing. So to get to see the USS Titan in action under Captain Riker, something Trek fans have wanted for over a decade, if not longer, since it was teased in Star Trek Nemesis, was just so incredibly cathartic. And the same goes for smaller background elements in this show, such as learning little hints of what happened to places like Bajor, the main setting for Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which was hinted at the very inclusion of the Bajoran Shax as a security officer, saying that maybe Bajor actually finally joined the Federation after the events of Deep Space Nine. This show was in many ways the payoff that Trekkies have always wanted since Star Trek stopped going forward with Star Trek Nemesis. But again, that does slightly go back to the issue that I was talking about before, where Lower Decks sometimes feels like an insider baseball type show for Trekkies rather than for anyone else. That all being said, it's really hard to critique humor because comedy is really dependent on individuals' taste. Either you think it's funny or you don't, and explaining why a joke works often ruins it. But even more so, something can still be funny based on delivery alone, something that I know all too well because I'm not really that funny if you really think about the jokes that I make. I just say lots of funny things in a weird voice like this so you laugh at me. I'm funny. Laugh at me. I'm a clown. I'm sorry, that got really personal and deep there for a second. Like and subscribe. But speaking of delivery, Lower Decks cast is spot on perfect. Every cast member feels like they're giving 100% and have amazing comedic timing and delivery, really selling the jokes but still bring humanity to their characters. I'll specifically highlight Mariner's Tawny Newsome, Boimler's Jack Quaid, and Captain Freeman's Dawn Lewis as the standouts, but honestly there isn't a weak link in the entire bunch. So, in the end, what did I think of Star Trek Lower Decks? Overall, I think it's a truly excellent and unique addition to the Star Trek universe. Despite its incredible ambition and legacy, it managed to both live up to everything that's come before and still feel uniquely its own. It's incredibly funny and a witty deconstruction of Star Trek, while still feeling like a love letter to the series itself and still feeling like it fits into the larger tapestry of the universe and telling really interesting character-focused stories. It manages to walk that tight line between parody and homage, and yet that even in and of itself seemed to help the show forge its own path forward and build its confidence in itself way earlier than perhaps any Trek series before it, leading to what I may think is the best and strongest first season of any Star Trek show to date. Though, to be fair, that's not exactly a hard fight to win. While I do have some reservations about the show as a whole, such as its relatively more tepid approach to Trek's usually more strongly felt social and political messaging, or its mild over-reliance on using references to Trek's past in place of jokes, the show's relatable characters, smart dissection of the franchise, and true, earnest belief in Star Trek's hope for the future of humanity makes this a welcome addition to the Star Trek franchise, in my book.
She's your mentor?
Lower Decks, Lower
Congrats,
Decks,
man.
Lower Decks,
Cool.
teamwork, spirit, community, Lower Decks, Lower Decks, Lower Decks. You're gonna be my Chadich from now on, baby.
And that's it for my review of Star Trek Lower Decks Season 1. And that means that coming up is my reviews of Star Trek Discovery Season 3. Yes, I'm going to be reviewing, as I did with Lower Decks, every single Star Trek Discovery episode right after it comes out, so please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any of those. I am honestly so excited for Discovery Season 3. It honestly, I think this might be the season of Discovery that I've been most excited for, so please join me for all of that, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'd also love to hear all of your thoughts about Star Trek Lower Decks Season 1 down in the comments below. Did you agree with my dissection of it? Did you disagree? Did you like it a lot more? Did you hate it? Did you think it was the worst Trek show ever? Did you think it was the best Trek show ever? I'd love to hear all of that down in the comments. Also, if you want to help support me doing these reviews and other discussions of Star Trek and really all of pop culture and talking about about LGBTQ issues and social and other political issues in science fiction and pop culture, don't forget you can help me out over on Patreon. That really helps me get to do this full time, helps me keep me going, and gets yourself cool perks like your name in videos and other things like that, as well as things like as well as my exclusive podcast, The Long Road, where I go through and rewatch every episode of Star Trek Enterprise. Alright, beyond all of that stuff, beyond my Patreon, beyond commenting, beyond subscribing, behind the way too many things that I do with my life, I'm just glad that you stopped by, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. A huge thank you to my amazing patrons who make this channel happen, and an extra special thank you to Miranda Janelle, Ashley Allen Bokikio, Eli Berg-Moss, Ashlyn Solstice, Christina Dalliance, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Wellington Marcus, Wayne Twitchell, Buttoneer, Ish the Mad, Munir Amlani, John Steele, Gavin Robinson, William Stewart, Michael Beam, Spock TOS, BBD, Nathan Olson, The Sir Spence, Zach Cody, Bree Beecher, Maeve, Chloe Dollar, Subraxis, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Tanya Trummer, Gretchen Badger, Dante St. James, Polly Mina, Piston Twisted Garage, Mark the Edge, and Din. I could not do this without all of you, so thank you so much, especially this month.